electronics engineer and his 12-year-old son, vanished from Death Valley Desert Campsite in 2016. Emergency radio equipment still transmitting distress signals, but both Mike and Tommy were gone without any trace. But the real shock came years later, when what they found preserved in desert sand made investigators realize Death Valley held impossible secrets about time itself. Mike Rodriguez had been planning this Death Valley camping trip for months. As an electronics engineer specializing in emergency communication systems, he understood better than most how quickly things could go wrong in remote locations. Teaching his 12-year-old son Tommy about survival communication wasn't just a fun father-son activity. It was potentially life-saving education. "Dad, why do we need to learn all this radio stuff?" Tommy asked as they loaded camping gear into their truck on a Friday morning in November 2016. "Can't we just use cell phones if something happens?" Mike smiled, remembering asking his own father similar questions years ago. "Cell towers don't work everywhere, buddy, especially not where we're going. In Death Valley, if you need help, you better know how to use a radio properly." Tommy was at that age where he questioned everything but still looked up to his father as the ultimate authority on technical matters. Mike had been carefully nurturing his son's interest in electronics, hoping to share his passion for communication technology. "Will we really talk to people far away?" Tommy asked, his excitement growing as Mike loaded the amateur radio equipment. "We'll try to make contact with other ham radio operators around the country," Mike explained. "And I'm going to teach you proper emergency procedures, how to call for help if we ever really needed it." The drive to Death Valley took them through increasingly barren landscape. Mike used the time to explain radio fundamentals, frequency bands, signal propagation, and the importance of clear communication during emergencies. "Emergency radio communication saved my life once," Mike told Tommy as they entered Death Valley National Park. "I was working on a cell tower in the mountains when a storm hit. Regular communications failed, but I had a portable radio. That emergency call brought rescue teams to exactly the right location." Tommy listened with growing fascination. His father's work had always seemed mysterious and important, but now he was getting a glimpse into skills that could actually save lives. They set up camp at a remote site Mike had chosen specifically for its radio-friendly characteristics: high elevation, clear sight lines, and minimal electronic interference. The nearest other campers were miles away, giving them perfect conditions for their communication exercises. "First rule of emergency radio," Mike said as he assembled their antenna system. "Always set up your equipment properly before you need it. In a real emergency, you won't have time to figure things out." Tommy helped with the setup, learning to identify different components and understand their functions. Mike was patient but thorough, explaining not just what to do but why each step mattered. As evening approached, they began their first communication session. Mike showed Tommy how to tune the radio, find clear frequencies, and follow proper amateur radio etiquette. CQ, this is KD7ABC Mobile in Death Valley, looking for evening traffic," Mike transmitted, using his call sign and following standard procedures. Responses came from across the western United States. Tommy was amazed to hear voices from California, Arizona, and Nevada, all crystal clear despite the vast distances. "Now you try," Mike said, handing Tommy the microphone. "Remember, speak clearly and identify our call sign." Tommy's first attempts were nervous and tentative, but he quickly gained confidence. Soon he was chatting with a retired teacher in Phoenix about his school projects and a park ranger in Yosemite about desert wildlife. "This is amazing, Dad," Tommy said during a break between contacts. "I can't believe we're talking to all these people." Mike felt a warm satisfaction watching his son discover the magic of radio communication. This was exactly what he'd hoped for, sharing not just technical knowledge, but the wonder of connecting with people across impossible distances. They practiced emergency procedures as darkness fell. Mike taught Tommy the international distress signals, proper emergency frequencies, and how to provide accurate location information. In a real emergency, You need to stay calm and be precise, Mike emphasized. Give your exact location, describe the problem clearly, and repeat the information until someone acknowledges receiving your call. Tommy practiced emergency scenarios, learning to transmit their GPS coordinates and describe hypothetical problems with the clarity that could save lives. Around 10 p.m., they began what Mike called final practice, a complete emergency communication drill using their backup battery-powered radio. Pretend our main equipment failed, Mike instructed. You need to set up the emergency radio and call for help. I'll time you to see how quickly you can establish contact. Tommy approached the exercise with the seriousness his father had taught him. He carefully connected the antenna, checked battery levels, and tuned to the emergency frequency. Mayday, Mayday, this is emergency station in Death Valley, Tommy transmitted, his voice steady and clear, requesting assistance for, but he never finished the sentence. Mike was monitoring Tommy's transmission when he noticed movement in the darkness beyond their campfire light. Something large was approaching their campsite. Not an animal, but something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Tommy, stop transmitting, Mike said quietly, his engineering mind trying to process what he was seeing. The approaching presence seemed to interfere with their radio equipment, creating static and distortion that grew stronger as it came closer. Tommy looked up from the radio, following his father's gaze toward the approaching darkness. Dad, what is that? The emergency radio in Tommy's hands began transmitting on its own, broadcasting a signal that neither father nor son was creating. The static resolved into what sounded almost like voices, but speaking in no language either of them recognized. Mike's paternal instincts kicked in immediately. Whatever was happening, his first priority was protecting his son. Tommy, stay close to me, he said, reaching for their emergency flashlight. But when Mike activated the flashlight, its beam seemed to bend and twist around the approaching presence, creating impossible shadows that moved independently of any physical object. The emergency radio continued its unauthorized transmission, now broadcasting what sounded like coordinates, but not for any location on Earth that Mike could recognize. Dad, I'm scared, Tommy whispered, moving closer to his father. Mike put his arm around his son, his mind racing through possible explanations. As an electronics engineer, he knew equipment malfunctions, electromagnetic interference, and atmospheric anomalies, but nothing in his technical experience explained what they were witnessing. The presence in the darkness seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, and with each pulse their radio equipment responded with increasingly complex transmissions. It was as if something was attempting to communicate through their emergency radio, using it as a bridge between realities. We need to, Mike began, but his words were cut off as the pulsing light suddenly intensified, enveloping their entire campsite in a soft, warm glow that felt somehow familiar despite being completely impossible. Tommy gripped the emergency radio tightly, and Mike noticed that his son's fear was transforming into something else, curiosity, even wonder. The radio had become warm in Tommy's hands, and the transmissions it was making had evolved into something that almost sounded like music. Dad, Tommy said softly, I think it's trying to teach us something. The last thing Mike remembered was the sound of their emergency radio transmitting a perfect, clear signal that somehow conveyed not distress, but invitation, as if they were being offered the chance to learn communication techniques that transcended anything human technology had achieved. When park rangers found their campsite the next morning, everything was exactly as Mike and Tommy had left it. The emergency radio was still transmitting, broadcasting the same coordinates it had been sending all night, but the coordinates pointed to a location that didn't exist on any map of Earth, and Mike and Tommy Rodriguez were nowhere to be found. The emergency radio was still broadcasting when Park Ranger Patricia Santos discovered the abandoned campsite at 9:47 a.m. on Sunday morning. She'd been conducting routine patrols when she heard the continuous transmission coming from the remote camping area. What she found defied immediate explanation. The campsite was perfectly preserved, as if Mike and Tommy had simply stepped away moments before. Their tent remained properly staked, camping chairs positioned around a cold fire pit, and food supplies neatly stored in bear-proof containers. Nothing suggested struggle, panic, or hasty departure, but the emergency radio sitting on their camp table was broadcasting coordinates that pointed to nowhere on Earth. "This is Park Ranger Santos requesting immediate backup at grid reference Delta 7, Maria radioed to headquarters. "I have an abandoned campsite with ongoing emergency transmission, but no sign of the campers." Detective James Wilson arrived within 2 hours, leading a team that included search and rescue specialists and communications experts. As a 20-year veteran of missing persons cases in extreme environments, Wilson had seen everything from heat stroke victims to people who simply walked away from their lives. But the Rodriguez case immediately struck him as different. "The radio equipment is functioning perfectly," reported communications specialist Dr. Linda Chen after examining their setup. "But it's transmitting coordinates that don't correspond to any location on Earth. The signal is strong, clear, and definitely coming from this equipment." Mike's truck remained parked exactly where he'd left it, keys in the ignition and personal belongings undisturbed. Tommy's backpack sat in the tent with his schoolwork and favorite book still inside. Most puzzling, both father and son had left behind their wallets, cell phones, and identification. "People don't just vanish from a desert campsite without taking anything," Detective Wilson told his team. "Either something happened to them here, or they left voluntarily but planned to return quickly." The search effort began immediately. Death Valley's extreme environment made time critical. If Mike and Tommy were lost or injured, they couldn't survive long without water and shelter. Helicopter teams with thermal imaging equipment scanned thousands of acres of desert terrain. Ground search parties explored every accessible canyon, rock formation, and water source within a 20-mile radius. Bloodhounds tracked their scent from the campsite but lost the trail within 100 yards, as if the father and son had simply stopped existing. Mike's ex-wife Carmen flew in from Los Angeles as soon as she received notification. Her relationship with Mike had ended 3 years earlier, but they'd maintained an amicable co-parenting arrangement centered on Tommy's well-being. "Mike would never put Tommy in danger," Carmen insisted during her interview with Detective Wilson. "He's obsessive about safety, especially in remote areas. That's why he was teaching Tommy all those emergency procedures." The investigation expanded to examine Mike's personal and professional life. As an electronics engineer, he had security clearance for government communication projects, leading investigators to consider whether his disappearance might be related to his work. Mike was involved in designing emergency communication systems for military applications, explained his supervisor, Dr. Robert Kim. "But nothing classified and nothing that would make him a target for kidnapping. He was just a dedicated engineer who loved his job and his son." Friends and family described Mike as a devoted father who had thrown himself into single parenting after his divorce. Tommy was his world, and their weekend camping trips had become a cherished tradition. "Mike talked about that Death Valley trip for weeks," said his neighbor, Janet Rodriguez. "He was so excited to share his technical knowledge with Tommy. He kept saying it might save their lives someday." The emergency radio continued broadcasting throughout the investigation, transmitting the same impossible coordinates 24 hours a day. Communications experts from across the government arrived to analyze the signal, hoping it might contain clues about Mike and Tommy's fate. "The transmission is definitely coming from their equipment," confirmed Dr. Sarah Martinez from the Federal Communications Commission. "But the signal characteristics are unlike anything we've seen. It's broadcasting with power levels that should be impossible from a battery-operated device, and the coordinates reference a coordinate system that doesn't match any known mapping standard." Weeks passed without any trace of the missing father and son. The search area expanded to cover hundreds of square miles, with volunteers joining professional rescue teams in the desperate hunt for clues. Carmen established a command center at a nearby motel, coordinating search efforts and media appeals. Missing person flyers with Mike and Tommy's photos appeared throughout California and Nevada. Their story attracted national attention, with amateur radio operators across the country monitoring for any sign of their transmissions. But as autumn turned to winter, hope began to fade. Death Valley was an unforgiving environment where people could die from exposure within hours during temperature extremes. If Mike and Tommy had become lost or injured, they couldn't have survived weeks without rescue. The official search was scaled back after 2 months, though park rangers continued watching for any sign of the missing father and son during their regular patrols. The emergency radio was eventually moved to a communications laboratory for continued analysis, but it never stopped broadcasting those mysterious coordinates. Carmen returned to Los Angeles to wait for news that never came. She kept Tommy's room exactly as he'd left it and maintained Mike's amateur radio station, hoping they might somehow use it to call home. "I refuse to give up," Carmen told a reporter on the 6-month anniversary of their disappearance. "Mike and Tommy are survivors. If there's any way to come home, they'll find it." But as months turned into years, even Carmen's hope began to waver. Detective Wilson retired in 2019, the Rodriguez case still weighing on his conscience. 3 years of investigation, and we never found a single clue, he told his replacement. "It's like they were teleported off the face of the earth." The case joined Death Valley's long list of unexplained disappearances. The extreme environment had claimed many visitors over the decades, but most left some trace behind. Abandoned vehicles, scattered belongings, or remains eventually discovered by search teams. Mike and Tommy Rodriguez had simply vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. Carmen tried to rebuild her life, but losing both her ex-husband and son in one impossible event proved overwhelming. She moved to Oregon in 2018, seeking distance from the desert that had swallowed her family. But she never stopped monitoring amateur radio frequencies, listening for any transmission that might bring them home. The emergency radio that had started broadcasting impossible coordinates the night they vanished was eventually donated to a university research program studying anomalous communications phenomena. Scientists continued documenting its transmissions, hoping to understand how a simple amateur radio device could broadcast signals that seemed to originate from outside normal space-time. Local amateur radio operators made pilgrimages to the campsite where Mike and Tommy had vanished, trying to recreate the conditions that might have triggered their mysterious transmission. But the site remained stubbornly normal, offering no clues about what had happened that November night. By 2020, the Rodriguez disappearance had become local legend, a cautionary tale about Death Valley's dangers, and a mystery that haunted everyone who'd participated in the search. Park rangers still reported the campsite to visiting amateur radio enthusiasts who would set up equipment and try to detect any residual signals from whatever had taken Mike and Tommy. But the desert kept its secrets, and the years passed without answers. Until 2024, when Dr. Patricia Santos made a discovery that reopened the case and challenged everything investigators thought they knew about the night Mike and Tommy Rodriguez vanished from their Death Valley campsite. The truth was stranger than anyone had imagined. Dr. Patricia Santos had been studying Death Valley's geological formations for over a decade when she made the discovery that would reopen the Rodriguez case. As a desert researcher specializing in wind erosion patterns, she spent weeks each year documenting how sand movements shaped the valley's landscape. On a scorching afternoon in July 2024, Dr. Santos was investigating unusual sand formations near the area where Mike and Tommy had vanished 8 years earlier. Recent satellite images had shown unexpected changes in dune patterns that didn't match her wind movement models. She was photographing what appeared to be a recently shifted dune when her metal detector began producing readings that made no sense. The device indicated a large metallic object buried approximately 3 feet below the surface. but geological surveys showed this sand formation had been stable for over 50 years. Dr. Santos began careful excavation, using precise archaeological techniques. What she uncovered defied every principle of desert geology she knew. Half buried in sand that her own research confirmed hadn't been disturbed in decades was a vintage emergency radio, the exact type used by amateur radio operators in the 1970s and 80s. Attached to the device was a metal plate engraved with "Property of Ems Rodriguez, KD7ABC," along with contact information that matched the missing electronics engineer perfectly. Dr. Santos immediately contacted park authorities, who recognized the significance of her discovery. Within hours, Detective Lisa Chen was examining the impossible evidence. "This doesn't make sense," Detective Chen said, studying the excavation site. "How can equipment belonging to people who disappeared in 2016 be buried in sand formations that haven't moved since the 1970s? The radio was transported to the FBI's Technical Analysis Facility in Las Vegas, where electronics experts began examination of equipment that shouldn't exist. Agent Michael Torres led the analysis. His findings were immediately classified. The radio is definitely from the 1970s, but the engraving was done much more recently, probably within the last 10 years. But the most disturbing discovery came when technicians powered up the device. The radio began broadcasting immediately, transmitting the same impossible coordinates that Mike and Tommy's equipment had been sending the night they vanished. But now there was something else mixed in with the signal. "We're detecting voice transmissions embedded in the carrier wave," reported Dr. Susan Kim, the facility's lead communications analyst. "They appear to be human voices speaking English." The voices were unmistakably those of Mike and Tommy Rodriguez. "This is KD7ABC emergency station, transmitting from coordinates unknown," came Mike's voice, distorted but clearly recognizable. "If anyone receives this transmission, please relay to our families that we are alive and trying to return." Tommy's voice followed, older and more mature than when he'd vanished as a 12-year-old. "Dad's teaching me about time transmission protocols. We learned that radio waves can travel between different temporal layers if you know the right frequencies." The transmissions continued for hours, providing updates that spanned the 8 years since their disappearance. Mike and Tommy described learning to navigate what they called temporal currents, flows of time that operated according to different physical laws. "We're not lost in space," Mike's voice explained. "We're lost in time. This desert exists in multiple temporal layers simultaneously, and we fell through to a different timeline." Tommy's voice provided detailed explanation. "We've been working with other people who got trapped in different time layers. There's a whole community of missing persons here, all trying to find ways to communicate with their original timelines. The vintage radio was our attempt to create a temporal beacon," Mike added. "By burying it in a sand formation that exists across multiple timelines, we hoped it would eventually surface in your time period." The implications were staggering. If genuine, it meant they had survived and were attempting to return from temporal exile. Tommy's final transmission was most remarkable. "We've learned how to manipulate the temporal currents, but returning requires precise timing and the right kind of energy signature. The desert holds secrets about time itself." Dr. Santos returned to the excavation site with ground-penetrating radar, searching for other temporally displaced objects. Her scans revealed anomalies throughout the area, metallic signatures buried in formations that shouldn't contain modern materials. The vintage radio continued broadcasting daily transmissions, providing a window into their experiences in what they called the temporal desert. "Time moves differently here," Tommy explained. "We've been here for 8 years from your perspective, but we've experienced decades of subjective time." Mike's engineering expertise had been crucial to survival. "I've been reverse engineering technology left behind by other temporal castaways, people from different eras who figured out pieces of how this place works. But their transmissions also carried warnings. Don't try to find us by coming to the coordinates we vanished from. The temporal rifts are unpredictable and dangerous. Carmen Rodriguez was contacted immediately when transmissions were authenticated. For the first time in 8 years, she had proof they were alive. "I knew they were survivors," she sobbed. "But this is beyond anything I imagined possible." The vintage radio had become humanity's first confirmed communication device capable of receiving transmissions from displaced time periods. Scientists worldwide arrived to study the phenomenon. But the most important question remained: could Mike and Tommy actually return, or were they permanently trapped in a version of Death Valley that existed outside normal time? Dr. Sarah Kim, a quantum physicist specializing in temporal mechanics, arrived at the Death Valley research site within 48 hours of the vintage radio discovery. Her reputation for investigating impossible phenomena had made her the government's go-to expert for cases that challenged conventional physics. "If we're really receiving communications from displaced time periods," Dr. Kim told the assembled team, "then Death Valley represents the most significant scientific discovery in human history." Her analysis of the vintage radio revealed properties that defied current understanding of electronics and time. The device was functioning as a bridge between different temporal layers, receiving and transmitting signals across decades. The radio's internal components show modifications that shouldn't be possible with 1970s technology, Dr. Kim reported. "Someone has integrated circuitry that manipulates quantum fields at a subatomic level." Mike's voice came through the radio during her examination. "Dr. Kim, if you're listening, you're correct about the quantum modifications. I've spent years learning to work with temporal technology left behind by previous castaways." The direct response sent shockwaves through the research team. They could not only receive transmissions, but Mike and Tommy could hear conversations around their vintage radio. "Tommy and I have discovered that Death Valley sits on what we call a temporal fault line," Mike continued. "Just like geological fault lines create earthquakes, temporal fault lines create rifts in time itself." Tommy's mature voice added crucial details. "The desert exists in multiple time streams simultaneously. We fell through to a timeline that runs parallel to yours, but at a different rate." Dr. Kim worked to understand the implications. "What you're describing would require exotic matter and energy levels we can't achieve with current technology." "The secret isn't advanced technology," Mike explained. "It's understanding that time isn't linear in certain geological formations. Death Valley's unique mineral composition creates natural temporal distortions." Tommy provided technical explanation. "Dad figured out that the desert's crystalline formations act like temporal lenses, focusing and bending time, streams the way optical lenses bend light." Dr. Kim's instruments detected massive energy fluctuations throughout the area. Her readings suggested the presence of chronoton particles, theoretical particles that exist outside normal time flow. "We're seeing evidence of chronoton particles," Dr. Kim announced. "If they're really here, it proves temporal manipulation is possible." Mike responded with excitement. "Dr. Kim, you're the first scientist in your timeline to detect chronoton emissions. We've been working with these particles for years, but the most remarkable revelation came when Tommy explained what they'd learned about other missing persons. Death Valley isn't the only temporal fault line. There are locations worldwide where people have fallen through time. A family that disappeared from the Bermuda Triangle in 1987 has been trying to return for decades," Mike added. "A group of hikers who vanished in the Himalayas learned to send messages through ice formations." Dr. Kim realized they were documenting a global phenomenon. "How many people are trapped in these temporal displacements?" "Hundreds, maybe thousands," Tommy replied. "People who disappeared without explanation throughout history." The implications were staggering. Unexplained disappearances throughout human history might represent people falling through temporal fault lines into parallel time streams. "We've been working on a way to return," Mike transmitted. but it requires precise coordination between timelines. We need someone in your time period to create a specific electromagnetic signature. Dr. Kim studied the technical specifications Mike provided. What you're describing would require enormous amounts of energy focused at a specific location and time. Actually, you do have the equipment, Tommy explained. The radio telescope array at the Very Large Array in New Mexico can be reconfigured to generate the electromagnetic pulse we need. Dr. Kim contacted the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. Within hours, teams of scientists were working to reprogram the massive radio telescope array for the most ambitious rescue attempt in human history. We'll have only one opportunity, Mike warned. The temporal alignment needed for our return only occurs during specific astronomical conditions. The next alignment happens in 72 hours, Tommy added. If we miss this window, we'll have to wait another 8 years. Dr. Kim worked around the clock to understand the temporal mechanics involved. Her calculations showed the return attempt would create massive disturbances in local space-time. Carmen Rodriguez flew back from Oregon, desperate to be present for her family's return attempt. 8 years of thinking they were dead, and now they're coming home, she sobbed to reporters. The radio telescope array was reconfigured according to Mike's specifications. Scientists worldwide monitored the unprecedented experiment. We're ready on this end, Dr. Kim reported to the vintage radio. All systems are configured for the electromagnetic pulse you've requested. Mike's voice carried determination and hope. Tommy and I have been preparing for this moment for years. We never stopped believing we could come home. Dad taught me that good engineering and determination can solve any problem, Tommy added, his voice now clearly that of a young man who had grown up in impossible circumstances. Dr. Kim initiated the countdown for the most complex rescue operation ever attempted. Radio telescopes across New Mexico began generating electromagnetic pulses designed to create a bridge between time streams. Electromagnetic pulse initiating in 10 seconds, Dr. Kim announced. Mike, Tommy, we're bringing you home. The vintage radio fell silent for the first time in weeks, as if waiting for the moment when past and present would converge in the Death Valley desert. The rescue attempt was about to begin. The electromagnetic pulse from the Very Large Array hit Death Valley at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. That would be remembered as the day humanity proved time travel was possible. Dr. Kim watched her instruments as massive energy readings spiked across the desert. The space-time disturbance was so intense that electronic equipment for 50 miles experienced temporary failures. The air began to shimmer like heat waves, but cold instead of warm. A temporal rift was opening, creating a bridge between timelines. Carmen Rodriguez stood behind safety barriers, tears streaming down her face as reality bent in front of her. "Come on, Mike," she whispered. "Bring our boy home." The rift stabilized for exactly 93 seconds, just long enough for two figures to step through from a parallel timeline. Mike Rodriguez emerged first, looking exactly as he had 8 years ago, but with eyes holding wisdom from decades of impossible adventures. Behind him came Tommy, no longer a 12-year-old boy, but a 20-year-old man who had grown up where different laws of physics applied. They carried equipment that shouldn't exist, devices constructed from crystalline materials that pulsed with their own light. In Tommy's hands was a radio that appeared grown rather than manufactured. "We made it," Mike said simply, his voice hoarse with emotion as the temporal rift closed. "We're home." Carmen broke through safety barriers and ran to embrace her family. 8 years of grief culminating in a reunion that defied everything science knew about time. But Dr. Kim's instruments detected disturbing readings throughout Death Valley. "The temporal pulse created more than just a bridge," Dr. Kim announced. "We're seeing multiple new rifts opening across the desert. The rescue operation has destabilized the entire temporal fault line." Tommy looked up from his reunion, face showing concern from years of temporal experience. Dr. Kim is right, he said with authority. Our return has created cascade effects. Other temporal barriers are weakening. Mike nodded grimly. Our escape route has created opportunities for other displaced people to return to their original timelines. Over the following hours, people who had vanished from Death Valley over 50 years began emerging from temporal rifts. A family of 4 who disappeared in 1987 stepped through a rift near Badwater Basin, having aged only slightly despite being gone for decades. A solo hiker who vanished in 2003 emerged carrying journals documenting 20 years in a different version of Death Valley. Each returning person brought back technology and knowledge that challenged fundamental assumptions about physics and reality. The temporal layers aren't random, Tommy explained to Dr. Kim. There's a pattern to displacement and return. Dad and I learned to read the temporal currents. Mike had become more than an electronics engineer during displacement. His understanding of time manipulation now exceeded anything human science had achieved. We didn't just survive in the temporal desert, Mike told assembled scientists. We learned from other displaced people who had been there for centuries. There's an entire community of temporal refugees. The crystalline radio Tommy carried incorporated elements that didn't exist in our periodic table. This radio can communicate across temporal barriers, Tommy explained. We've been in contact with displaced people worldwide. The temporal fault lines form a network spanning the entire planet. But the most disturbing revelation came when Mike described what they'd learned about displacement sources. The fault lines aren't natural, he said gravely. They're artificial, created by technology from civilizations that existed long before human history. Ancient beings who developed the ability to manipulate time itself. Dr. Kim felt the implications hit her. These temporal rifts are alien technology? Not alien, Tommy corrected. Terrestrial, but from species that evolved and disappeared millions of years before humans. Death Valley sits on ruins of temporal manipulation devices that are still partially functional. The rescue operation had activated dormant temporal technology beginning to function again after eons of inactivity. We estimate temporal rifts will continue opening worldwide for several months, Mike explained. Thousands of missing people may have the opportunity to return. Dr. Kim realized they were facing the most significant event in human history. It means everything we thought we knew is just the beginning, Tommy replied. Dad and I learned just enough to survive, but there are civilizations that have mastered time and space in ways we can't imagine. Carmen held her son close, marveling at the young man he'd become. What happens now? Can we be a normal family? Mike and Tommy exchanged a look that spoke of shared experiences transcending normal family life. We can't unknow what we've learned, Mike said gently. Tommy and I have become bridges between timelines. We have responsibilities to people still lost in time. Dr. Kim established a permanent research station at Death Valley, studying ongoing temporal phenomena. Mike and Tommy became her primary consultants, using expertise to rescue families separated by impossible circumstances. 6 months after their return, they established the Temporal Rescue Foundation, dedicated to helping displaced persons return to original timelines. But even as they worked to solve missing persons mysteries worldwide, new questions emerged. The ancient technology beneath Death Valley was becoming increasingly active, creating rifts leading not just to parallel timelines but to completely different eras of Earth's history. Reports began coming in from around the world. Temporal rifts were opening in locations with similar geological characteristics. Ancient ruins incorporating temporal technology were being discovered. Missing persons throughout history were returning with knowledge that challenged everything. But as more people returned from temporal displacement, researchers detected troubling patterns. Some returnees brought back warnings about dangers lurking in the spaces between timelines. Entities that fed on temporal energy and were growing stronger as more rifts opened. We may have solved the mystery of missing persons, Tommy told Dr. Kim during a late-night briefing, but we've also awakened something that was better left sleeping. Deep in Death Valley's temporal research facility, monitoring equipment detected new energy signatures approaching through dimensional barriers. The ancient technology wasn't just bringing people home. It was opening pathways for things that had been trapped between timelines for millennia. Somewhere in the darkness between past and present, something that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity was finally finding its way toward our reality. The question wasn't whether more families would be reunited across impossible distances. The question was whether humanity was prepared for what else was coming through those temporal doorways.